He had won everything a gamer could win: 3 world championships, a crowd of 50,000 people on their feet, and then, between one heartbeat and the next, it was over. Not the match, but him. That is where this story begins. Not with a sword, not with a prophecy, not with a chosen hero who always knew he was special. It begins with a young man named Taeho, slumped over a keyboard in front of the biggest audience of his life, dead before anyone in the arena understood what had happened. The question is this: what does a man become when the world he died in counted every move he ever made, every record, every legendary play, every impossible victory, and decided those things were real? The answer is waiting. But first, let's go back to the moment it ended. Taeho had spent years becoming the best. Not in a field most people took seriously. Competitive gaming, the kind where teams practiced 16 hours a day and entire nations tuned in to watch young men stare at screens and move their fingers in ways that decided outcomes. He was 23. He had already won the world championship twice. The third title was 47 seconds from being his. He remembered his hands on the keys. He remembered the noise of the crowd swelling into something almost physical. He remembered the exact thought crossing his mind, that after this, he would finally rest. Then there was nothing. He did not feel himself fall. He did not see the medics rush toward the stage. He did not hear the announcer's voice cut into silence or the crowd's cheer collapsing into confusion. One moment he was there, and the next moment he was somewhere that should not have existed. A great hall. Stone columns carved with symbols he could not read. Torches burning without wind. And standing around him, massive men and women in armor, watching him with expressions somewhere between recognition and suspicion. Nobody screamed. Nobody called for help. The warriors around him simply looked at him as if measuring something. Taeho's first instinct was to assume he was dreaming. His second instinct, arriving about 3 seconds later when a warrior the size of a small vehicle leaned toward him and asked whether he remembered his death, was that this was considerably worse than a dream. He did not answer. His mouth opened and closed. His body, which he was already beginning to notice, felt lighter and somehow cleaner than it had in years, refused to cooperate with his brain's request to say something intelligent. The warrior smiled. It was not a warm smile exactly, but it was the kind of smile that meant the large man was not going to hurt him yet. His name was Jor. He had copper-colored hair, a scar running through one eyebrow, and the calm energy of someone who had died at least 3 times, and found the whole business manageable. He crouched down to Taeho's level, a gesture that still left him towering slightly, and explained the situation in the plainest terms he could manage. This was Valhalla. The warriors here had all died. Most of them died in battle, or in ways that demonstrated sufficient glory for the gods of Asgard to consider them worth keeping. They were brought here to fight in Ragnarok, the war that would decide whether the divine realm survived or fell to the forces of chaos. Warriors served gods, gods blessed their warriors. Blessed warriors grew stronger and fought harder battles. Taeho listened to all of this with the careful attention of a man who knew, on some level, that he was not supposed to be here, because he had not died in battle. He had died at a keyboard. He had not swung a sword or thrown a spear or done anything that any reasonable definition of glory would include. He was a professional esports player. The most celebrated one in the world, yes, but still a man whose primary skill involved pressing keys and moving a mouse with exceptional precision. He looked around at the warriors surrounding him, men and women built like the architecture of conquest, wearing armor stained with the marks of actual war, regarding him with expressions he was slowly realizing contained a significant amount of misplaced respect. They thought he was someone else, or rather they thought he was more than he was. He did not correct them, partly from shock, partly from the dawning, terrifying awareness that if he told the truth, the people around him might react badly. What Taeho did not know yet, what would take him some time to understand, was that the misunderstanding was not a misunderstanding at all. The system that governed power in Valhalla was built on sagas. A saga was the accumulated weight of a warrior's legendary accomplishments, transformed into real supernatural force. The greater a warrior's legend in life, the more powerful their saga became. It was not about how many people they had killed or how many battles they had won in the traditional sense. It was about the genuine, undeniable truth of what they had achieved. And Taeho, who had spent his entire adult life breaking records that people called impossible, clearing challenges that entire guilds of dedicated players had never beaten, accumulating a legacy inside a virtual world that millions of people had witnessed and verified and celebrated. Taeho had a saga, a very large one. He did not know this yet. He would not know it for a while. In the meantime, he stood in the great hall of Valhalla, trying to look like he belonged there, while a 300-pound warrior, with a cheerful demeanor, explained the rules of a divine war to him. Jor had clearly been designated as his guide, which Taeho suspected was related to Jor being the kind of person who found lost rookies, and decided, on some instinct, that they were worth the effort. He had a broad, open face, and he laughed at things that were not strictly funny, which Taeho would later learn was simply how Jor processed the general absurdity of dying and continuing anyway. He told Taeho to eat. The food at the feast table was not what Taeho would have chosen. Heavily salted meat and bread that could have been used as a construction material, but it was fuel, and his body, whatever it was now, seemed to need it. Around the table, warriors drank and argued and displayed the specific camaraderie of people who had all seen the same kinds of terrible things and decided to face the next terrible thing together. Nobody seemed afraid. Nobody seemed particularly concerned about the war they had been summoned to fight. This, Taeho would eventually understand, was because most of them had died before, some of them many times. In Valhalla, death was not the end. Warriors who fell in Ragnarok's battles became something called steel warriors, bound to the field forever, no longer truly alive, but not entirely gone either. It was a fate nobody wanted, but dying once, twice, even 3 times in service of a god who blessed you, that was simply the business of the place. The feast ended, and warriors were called to choose their gods. This was a formal process. The divine legions of Asgard each recruited from the warriors of Valhalla, and each god offered different blessings, different fighting styles, different advantages in the war. Thor's warriors were stronger. Odin's were wiser. Each god brought something the others did not. Taeho stood in line with the other rookies and tried to remember everything Jor had told him. He was doing this largely on instinct, which was how he had approached most of the significant decisions in his gaming career. Choose based on limited information, adapt as new information arrived. The principle had served him well enough to win 3 world championships. He applied it now. He chose Eden, goddess of youth and immortality. Her warriors healed faster, endured longer, grew stronger with time, rather than through sudden violent bursts of power. It was not the most glamorous choice. Thor's line was longer. Odin's had a kind of obvious prestige attached, but something in Taeho responded to the idea of a power that compounded, that built on itself, that rewarded patience and persistence over immediate force. He had been playing long games his entire career. He knew how to wait for the moment when accumulated advantage became decisive. The Valkyrie who registered him did not seem particularly impressed. She looked at his record, whatever Valhalla's system held for him, and her expression was professionally neutral. New warrior, unknown potential, assigned to Idun's legion, where he would begin at the bottom like everyone else. Her name was Raskrid. She had silver hair pulled back with military precision and eyes that evaluated everything twice before committing to a conclusion. She would become important to Taeho's story later. For now, she simply stamped his designation and moved to the next person in line. He was taken to a smaller hall where Idun's representative was waiting. Her name was Hela. She was not what Taeho expected. He had been building a picture of a divine representative in his mind. Something imposing. Something that matched the scale of the warriors around him. Hela was young-looking, with a warmth in her expression that seemed slightly at odds with the general atmosphere of consequence. She had amber hair and a patient way of listening that made people feel, almost immediately, that they were not stupid for asking the obvious questions. She introduced herself as his guide within Idun's legion. Her role was to help new warriors understand the system, develop their sagas, and survive long enough to become useful. She asked him about himself. He told her the truth. He was a gamer, a professional one. He had just been about to win his 3rd world championship when something happened and he ended up here. He did not know what a saga was or how to fight or what a rune did. He was reasonably certain he was completely unsuited to the environment he had landed in. Hela did not laugh. She did not look alarmed. She looked, actually, like someone filing away pieces of information she found potentially interesting. She told him that everyone started somewhere. She told him the saga system would tell them both more once he had been in a battle. The words "once he had been in a battle" landed in Taeho's chest with a specific weight. The battle came the next morning. He had been given basic equipment, armor that fit him well enough to move in, a short sword whose weight he did not know what to do with. Jor had walked him through the absolute fundamentals the night before. Which end of the sword was the dangerous one? How to hold it without dropping it? How to move so that armor worked with you rather than against you? Taeho had excellent coordination. This was, perhaps, the first time in his life that his gaming-trained reflexes had an obvious physical application. The battlefield was not what stories prepared people for. It was wide and loud and full of a chaos that no strategy could fully organize. Warriors moved in coordinated formations that had been drilled into them over many battles. Monsters came from the enemy side. Creatures of the sort that belonged in the mythology Taeho had grown up half-knowing, made real and wrong-scaled and aggressive in ways that reading about them had not conveyed. He stayed near Jor. This was survival instinct more than strategy. The first creature that came at him directly was not large. It was fast. It had too many limbs and moved in a way that suggested it had never learned what direction was supposed to be natural. Taeho stumbled back. His sword arm came up in something that was not quite a defensive movement and not quite an attack, and was mostly just his body making a decision without consulting his brain. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint awareness behind his eyes, not sight exactly, but a kind of pattern recognition that felt like the feeling of a strategy clicking into place during a match. He could see where the creature would be in 2 seconds, not because he had any combat experience, because his brain had spent years calculating movement patterns and predicting trajectories and identifying the optimal timing for an action. The sword connected. The creature stopped. He stood there breathing hard, looking at what he had done, and felt the world rearrange itself around a single piece of new information. His gaming reflexes worked in Valhalla. Not perfectly, not enough on their own to make him a warrior. But the underlying skills, the pattern recognition, the hand-eye coordination, the ability to read a situation and choose the right action faster than conscious thought, those were real, and they were his, and they had just proven themselves in a context that had nothing to do with a screen. Jor found him afterward, clapped him on the shoulder with enough force to nearly knock him over, and declared that he had known from the first moment that Taeho was going to be fine. Taeho did not feel fine. He felt shaken and lucky and aware that the creature he had killed had been significantly smaller than most of the things on the field. But he had survived the first day. That was something. Hela met him back at camp, looked at his minor wounds with the practical care of someone who had seen worse, and told him to rest. While he ate, more of the fortress-grade bread, she pulled up what she called his saga record and began reading through it. She went quiet. Not the quiet of someone concentrating, the quiet of someone recalibrating. She read for a long time. The firelight moved, other warriors talked and laughed at other tables. Hela turned pages, or whatever the Valhalla equivalent of pages was, with a growing expression that Taeho could not quite read from where he sat. He asked her what she was looking at. She looked up. Her expression had moved from quiet to something more careful. She told him that she needed to explain the saga system in more detail. She told him that a saga was not just a record, it was a source of power, and the more extraordinary the accomplishments it recorded, the more powerful the warrior who carried it became. She told him that sagas grew through synchronization, that he would need to unlock what was already there, that as he fought and grew, the saga would reveal more of itself. Then she said that his saga was unusual. He asked her to explain. She said she would, but she wanted him to understand first that the scale of what he carried was not something she had been expecting, and that she was sorry if she had not taken his arrival seriously enough in their first conversation. Taeho stared at her. An apology from his guide, on the first day, for underestimating him, was not a sentence he had expected to construct in his head. He asked again what the saga contained. She told him everything he had ever accomplished inside the game, every record he had broken, every legendary challenge he had cleared, every impossible achievement that the game's own system had flagged as extraordinary, every title and every championship and every moment where he had done something that nobody had done before. The game had kept meticulous records. Valhalla had read those records and recognized them for what they were: genuine legendary accomplishments, performed by a person who was genuinely extraordinary at what he did, in a world where those accomplishments had been witnessed and verified by millions. The saga did not care that the accomplishments had happened on a screen. The saga cared that they had happened. Taeho sat with that for a while. He had spent his entire career being told, in various ways, that what he did was not real, not serious. not comparable to other kinds of human achievement. He had learned to stop arguing about it and simply keep playing and keep winning. Now he was sitting in a divine hall in the afterlife, and a representative of a Norse goddess was apologizing to him because his gaming record was so extraordinary that it had overloaded her expectations. He ate the rest of his bread and thought about this. He did not say much, but something in him that had been braced for a very long time began, very slightly, to unclench. The following weeks were education and pain in equal measure. The saga system worked in layers. At the center of it was synchronization, the degree to which Taeho had learned to access the power his record contained. He began at 1%, not because his saga was weak, but because the gap between what the saga contained and what his body could currently use was enormous. Unlocking it required doing things that were difficult, gaining genuine experience, proving in real conditions that he deserved to access each new level. This appealed to him in a way he recognized. It was a progression system. He had been learning progression systems since he was 12 years old. The specific content was different. The structure was familiar. The runes helped. Enemies dropped them. Fragments of something crystallized, carrying attributes that warriors could absorb. Strength, agility, endurance, the capacity to use more of the divine power flowing through a saga. Taeho was thoughtful about which runes he spent and when. He watched how other warriors used them. He asked Hela questions until her answers told him what he actually needed to know. He treated the whole thing like theory crafting, the careful pre-battle analysis that serious competitive gamers did for hours before a major match. Other warriors found this slightly strange. Most of them were fighters by nature and experience. They did not calculate rune efficiency with a spreadsheet mentality. They swung things at other things and grew stronger through the experience of swinging. Taeho's approach was different, and it produced different results. The first major test came when the camp received word of Whitefang. Whitefang was not a name that inspired comfort. The warriors who said it lowered their voices slightly, not from fear exactly. These were not people who admitted to fear easily, but from the particular respect that experienced fighters gave to things that had earned it. It was a battlefield commander from the enemy side. Not a man, not something that had ever been human. A creature built along the lines of a wolf, but scaled to the kind of dimensions that made the word wolf feel like a category error. It had destroyed 3 forward camps in the past month. Its kills included warriors who had survived Ragnarok's campaigns for years. The plan was to push it back. Not necessarily to kill it. Commanders on both sides had longer timelines than individual battles, but to hold the line and keep it from advancing further. Taeho heard this briefing and felt the old familiar pressure of a match where the stakes were real enough to make your hands cold. He spent the evening before the campaign doing what he always did before a major match, reviewing everything he knew, what abilities he had unlocked, what runes he had saved, what patterns he had noticed in the enemy movements he had seen so far. Hela sat with him for part of it, answering questions and pointing out things he had missed. She had stopped looking surprised by his questions. She had started looking instead like someone watching a strategy unfold that she had only partially predicted. Morning came hard and gray. The battlefield was a wide plain that had once been something else, and was now just the ground where 2 sides met. Taeho stayed with Ciri's unit, a commander whose calm was the kind built from experience rather than indifference, who organized her warriors into formations that accounted for what each of them could do rather than what she needed them to be. She had noticed Taeho early. Not because he was impressive yet, but because he paid attention in a way that was useful, and useful people were worth tracking. Ralph was there too, an archer with an easy manner and a habit of describing dangerous situations in tones that suggested mild inconvenience, which Taeho had initially found baffling and had come to realize was simply how Ralph processed everything. He called Taeho by a nickname he had invented immediately on meeting him, treated every mission as an opportunity to complain cheerfully about the conditions, and was one of the best scouts in the Legion. He was also, Taeho had discovered, significantly harder to rattle than he appeared. The battle opened the way battles did, with chaos that gradually resolved into patterns. Taeho's synchronization was at 5% now. Not enormous, but enough that he could feel the edges of his saga, a warmth in his hands, a sharpening in his vision, a kind of second layer of awareness that sat behind his normal senses. He could identify things. That was the Dragon Eyes ability, emerging now with growing clarity. A way of reading what he was looking at that went beyond ordinary sight. He could see information about enemies if he focused, strengths, weaknesses, the specific opening in a pattern that would matter. It was, functionally, exactly like being able to see the hitbox of an enemy in a game. He felt, absurdly, more comfortable than he should have. White Fang appeared on the field like a weather event. It did not walk into view so much as become present. A shift in the battlefield's atmosphere before the creature itself was visible, the kind of signal that experienced fighters read and rookies sometimes died not noticing. Taeho noticed. He told Siri what he was seeing through the dragon eyes. She relayed it. The formation adjusted. Warriors who had been moving in one direction changed angle, and the adjustment was subtle enough that White Fang's first charge hit a gap where the target had been, rather than the target itself. That bought 40 seconds. In a fight of this scale, 40 seconds mattered. What happened next was not elegant. Taeho had no illusions about elegance. He had saved runes specifically for this, not for the standard approach of improving basic attributes, but for a targeted unlock that Hela had identified as relevant to his saga's current state. The Warrior Sword, the ability to summon a weapon shaped by the saga's own power, rather than carrying one made by human hands. He pulled on it. Something came. The weapon that materialized in his grip was not what he expected. He had no framework for what he expected, exactly, but the sword that answered his saga felt right in the way that very few things in his life had felt right immediately. The way a particular keyboard had felt when he first played on it at 17. The way a specific strategy had felt when he first saw how it would unfold. It fit him, not because he was a sword fighter, because the weapon was made from the record of everything he had achieved, and that record was genuinely his. White Fang was occupied with 3 other warriors when Taeho moved. He did not approach directly. He had watched enough of the pattern to know where the creature would be in 3 seconds, and he placed himself there instead of where it was. Anticipation over reaction. The same principle that had made him the best player in the world at his game. The blow he landed was not a killing blow. He was not strong enough for that, not yet, but it was precise. It hit exactly where the Dragon Eyes had told him to hit, in the specific opening that the creature's movement pattern created for roughly half a second every time it completed a turn. White Fang reacted. Its attention swung toward him. This was, depending on how you looked at it, either the worst or the best possible outcome. The worst because he now had the direct attention of a creature that had killed warriors with decades of experience. The best because Siri had been waiting for it. She had watched Taeho carefully enough over the past weeks to suspect he would create an opening through the same calculated approach he applied to everything. She had positioned her best fighters accordingly. They hit White Fang from 3 directions while its attention was on Taeho. He did not stand still while this was happening. He moved. He kept moving. His body, which had been learning the reflexes of a warrior, in addition to the gaming reflexes it had arrived with, found angles and distances that kept him alive in a way that felt, from the inside, like improvised mathematics. Constant tiny calculations that his hands and feet executed while his mind ran the larger picture. The saga pulsed. His synchronization ticked upward. 7% now, the new floor feeling like a room that had just gotten larger. White Fang went down. Not from Taeho alone. Not from any single warrior. From the specific coordination of people who understood each other well enough to make a plan work even when the plan had stopped looking like a plan from the inside. Taeho had contributed a critical piece. The finishing blow was someone else's, which he did not mind at all. In team competition, the play that created the kill was often more important than the kill itself. The camp that night was loud. Warriors who had been watching the rookies with professional evaluation began looking at Taeho differently. Not as someone who had arrived with unearned reputation, but as someone who had earned a piece of new reputation in real conditions. Jor found him after, sat down beside him without ceremony, and said that he had done well. He said it the way people said things they meant rather than things they thought you needed to hear, and Taeho found himself not knowing what to do with the uncomplicated kindness of it. Hela, reviewing his record afterward, found that the White Fang battle had triggered something in his saga's list of unlockables. The Dragon Eyes had fully crystallized. She explained what it meant, not just identification of enemies and weaknesses, but a deeper reading ability that would grow as he grew. She explained it with the specific, careful patience she had developed for him, watching his face to see which parts clicked immediately and which required a second pass. She also told him that she had now gone through his full saga list and that she was not going to tell him how many pages it was, because she did not want him to develop either ego or anxiety from knowing the number before he was ready to use it. He asked her anyway. She looked at him for a moment, then looked away, then looked back. She said it was a great many. He nodded. He held this information with the same careful steadiness he applied to most things, setting it aside to examine later, because there were more immediate concerns. The next campaign was already scheduled. The Black Fortress. This was a different scale of operation from the White Fang engagement. The fortress was a permanent enemy installation, a structure of dark stone at a geographic point that mattered strategically, held by a garrison that had been reinforcing itself for months. Taking it would require not just a battle but an assault, organized approach, breach, clearance of the interior, and enough force to hold it afterward against the inevitable counterattack. Taeho went into this one having slept badly and thought carefully. The approach was called Steel Rain, a technique where warriors were launched toward a fortified position at high speed, trading control for surprise. Taeho, who had not known this was a thing that could happen to a person, discovered that his instinct to immediately calculate the optimal angle of approach during a mid-air descent toward a battlemented wall was both highly specific and apparently useful. He landed harder than he would have preferred, so did everyone else. The walls were contested before the dust settled. Inside the fortress, the Dragon Eyes came into their own. The interior was dark and complicated, and full of enemies who knew the space in ways the attackers did not. Taeho moved through it using the Dragon Eyes to read ahead, identifying concentrations of enemies, finding structural features that could be used for cover, spotting the things that his allies were about to walk into before they walked into them. He relayed what he saw in short, specific terms that Ciri had learned to trust. Ralph stayed near him. The archer's particular skill set and Taeho's situational awareness had developed an informal rhythm over several campaigns. Taeho found the openings and Ralph filled them with arrows, a combination that was more effective than either of them would have been separately. They reached a control room deep inside the fortress. This was the operational center, the place from which the garrison coordinated its defense. Taking it would break the coordination of the forces above and make the rest of the assault significantly cleaner. What was inside the control room was not what they expected. The commander of the Black Fortress was called Red Eyes. The name was not metaphorical. His eyes were the specific red of something that had been built to be dangerous rather than arriving there accidentally, and the aura around him was the kind that Taeho's Dragon Eyes registered at a level that made the number it assigned feel almost disrespectful in how large it was. He was orders of magnitude more powerful than anything Taeho had faced. The fight that followed was not a fight Taeho could win through positioning alone. Red Eyes hit with force that was less like a physical attack and more like a decision, an assertion that the target should be somewhere else, delivered with enough supernatural authority that it was difficult to disagree. Taeho's armor absorbed what it could. His body absorbed the rest. He stayed on his feet longer than he should have been able to, which was mostly Idun's blessing doing work that Taeho was only partially aware of. He was nearly out, not metaphorically. His body had reached the edge of what it could continue to do, and his mind had registered this fact with the specific clarity that comes from total exhaustion rather than panic. He knew what his remaining resources were. He knew what he needed. He needed something he had not yet unlocked. He reached into the saga. Not strategically. There was no time for strategy now. He reached with the pure, desperate attention of someone who had been in competitive situations long enough to know that sometimes you did not calculate, you committed, and you found out afterward whether the commitment had been the right one. Something answered. The Skull Crusher, a saga entry that had been waiting for exactly this combination. A warrior pushed to his limit, a clear opponent, and enough synchronization to access a new level of force. It came up like a switch thrown in a dark room. Sudden, comprehensive, entirely changing what was possible. The fight changed. Taeho did not become invincible. He became enough. There is a difference, and it matters. The Red Eyes commander was still vastly more experienced, but Taeho had, through some combination of the saga's recognition of his genuine achievements and the hard work of the past weeks and the specific moment of committing without calculating, reached a level where enough was a real option. Red Eyes fell. The fortress fell with him. Warriors who cleared the interior found the control room afterward and saw Taeho and said things to each other that he heard the edges of but could not quite parse, standing there in the wreckage of a fight that had taken more from him than he wanted to admit. Raskrit arrived on the floor of the fortress with the specific energy of a senior officer reviewing a situation. She looked at the evidence of the fight. She looked at Teho. Something in her expression did a calculation and arrived at a revised conclusion. She did not say much. She was not someone who said much when a look communicated the same thing more efficiently. But the look said she had updated her assessment. The Dwarven Mine campaign came next, and Teho entered it, carrying the particular fatigue of someone who had not had enough recovery time, but understood that the war's schedule was not organized around his convenience. The mines were underground and had been abandoned by their original inhabitants, the dwarves who had built the tunnels that now served as contested territory, not abandoned cleanly. The things moving in the lower levels were what was left when a population that built things with divine metals was overrun by something that raised the dead. Undead dwarves. Moving through tunnels they had built in life, now serving something else. Teho dealt with this information the way he dealt with most information he found deeply unpleasant. He filed it under current tactical reality and focused on what could be done about it. The mine had a geography that his dragon eyes could read gradually as they descended. The passages, the chambers, the places where the undead concentration was highest, and where there were structural features that could be used or avoided. He became the unit's map as they went deeper, which was not a role he had expected to occupy, but which fit the way most things that were actually useful about him had turned out to fit. The thing controlling the undead was in the lowest level. It was a vampire, old enough and powerful enough that the word came with weight rather than genre connotations. It did not look like what stories prepared people for. It looked like something that had found a form it found convenient and occupied it with the patience of a creature to whom centuries were not an unusual span of time. The fight was different from anything Teho had yet encountered, because the vampire did not behave like a battlefield opponent. It moved in ways that suggested it was thinking about the fight from several layers above the immediate engagement, maneuvering them into positions before they realized they were being positioned, using the mine's geography as a weapon, making the environment itself part of what they were fighting. Teho recognized this. It was what high-level competitive play looked like from the inside. The way the best players were always fighting a version of the game that was 2 moves ahead of the one on screen. He started fighting back on that level. It was not enough to win. Not yet. The vampire pushed back but not defeated, transformed. The form it had been using dissolved and something else took its place. A creature the size of the mine's largest chamber, winged and fast and operating now on pure aggression rather than calculation. Teho's saga answered before he did. The Dragon Commander, a saga ability he had not known he possessed until the moment it arrived, recognizing this situation as exactly the kind of condition it had been waiting for. The ability to tame creatures of a certain nature, to assert a kind of dominion that was not force but something more like a conversation held at a level below words. He did not defeat the transformed vampire. He claimed it temporarily. The creature's own power and nature were too strong for a permanent binding, and he was not trying for one. But for long enough to end the fight on different terms than it had been heading toward, the enormous transformed creature was something he directed, rather than something that was trying to kill him. His allies, who had been very reasonably running a different calculation, adjusted rapidly. The vampire fell. The divine metal the dwarves had been mining, the reason the enemy had occupied the site in the first place, was recovered. Warriors found what they had come for. The mission had a clean ending, which was not always the case, and Teho appreciated this more than he would have a few months ago. The dwarves, grateful in the way that craftsmen are grateful when someone handles their work's location with appropriate care, gave him something in return. The falcon wings, a piece of work that had no functional equivalent in any system Teho had previously encountered. A cloak that was not a cloak, that transformed its wearer into something fast and aerial and very difficult to hit. He put it on. The sensation of becoming airborne by will rather than mechanism was, he decided, one of the more extraordinary things that had happened to him since dying, which was now a list with significant competition. He flew back to camp about 40 meters above the ground, which Ralph watched from below with an expression of profound professional betrayal. The celebration after the mines lasted one evening. Teho had learned by now that celebrations in Valhalla had a specific ceiling. They ran until someone with command authority started talking about the next operation, at which point the atmosphere shifted from feast to briefing, with very little transition time. The next operation arrived faster than anyone had expected. The word came in the middle of the night, not through any formal announcement process, through the kind of noise that woke warriors from deep sleep and had them reaching for weapons before their eyes were fully open, the specific cacophony of a perimeter under pressure from something much larger than the perimeter had been designed to handle. The Great Invasion. Taeho pulled on his armor in the dark, moving on muscle memory that had not existed 4 months ago and now sat in his body like something permanent. He found Jor at the edge of camp. He found Ralph already at an elevated position with his bow strung. He found Ciri organizing her formation with the quiet focus of someone who did not need to raise her voice to make people move faster. What was coming was not subtle. The earth moved before it arrived. Not metaphorically. The ground registered each footfall of the approaching force as a tremor, the kind that made liquid in containers ripple and made animals run the other direction. Taeho's dragon eyes swept the tree line ahead and returned information that required a moment to process, simply because the scale was outside his previous experience. A giant. Not in the casual sense that very large humans sometimes occupied the word. An actual giant, one of the ancient beings that the war called Ragnarok had been named for, moving through the forest at the edge of the camp's territory, with the unhurried momentum of something that understood its own size as a fundamental advantage. Trees broke against it rather than around it. The sky above its path was briefly occupied by birds that had made an instant unanimous decision to be elsewhere. Behind it, in the ordinary sense of behind, was an entire enemy force using its advance as cover. Taeho looked at this situation and felt the very particular sensation he had learned to recognize over his gaming career as the feeling of a map where the opponent had come prepared for the match you had practiced, rather than the match you were about to play. He told Ciri what the dragon eyes were giving him. She absorbed it with the specific efficiency of a commander who had learned that Taeho's readings were reliable and planned around them without wasting time on confirmation. The formation adjusted, signal fires went up, other units responded. Razgrid arrived from the sky, the Valkyrie landing in full armor with the controlled violence of someone who had calculated exactly how much force landing required and used precisely that, and took in the situation in a glance. She spoke briefly with the senior commanders. Then she found Taeho. She told him she needed aerial reconnaissance. The giant was the central problem, but it was not the only problem, and the forces behind it were organizing in ways that the ground units could not fully see. She needed someone who could go high enough to map what was actually there. He had the falcon wings. He went up. The transformation into falcon form was something he had practiced a handful of times since the mines, but not extensively. There had not been time or safe conditions for the kind of practice that made something reliable. He trusted it now because he had no other option, which was a kind of trust that felt different from competence but sometimes produced the same results. The view from above was clarifying in the way that most perspective shifts are clarifying. Things that had seemed large from the ground were revealed to be connected to larger things, and the larger things were connected to larger things still, and the whole picture was considerably more involved than the ground units knew. He mapped what he saw. Enemy positions, movement directions, the specific places where concentrated forces were massing. He returned to the ground long enough to relay this, then went back up before the information became stale. Razgrid took what he gave her and used it to direct the battle in ways that would not have been possible without the overhead view. She had the command sense to know which information changed which decisions, and she made those decisions quickly enough that the enemy formations found their approaches contested by forces that should not have known where to be. This did not solve the giant. The giant was not a tactical problem that positioning could fully address. It was a force of nature problem, the kind where the solution required matching force at a level that most of the warriors on the field could not individually reach. Several of the strongest warriors in the Legion converged on it. Even combined, the engagement was grinding rather than decisive. Taeho watched from above and thought about what he had. He had the dragon eyes. He had the falcon wings. He had the dragon commander ability, which he had used exactly once and under extreme duress, and which had required a creature of a specific nature to work on. He had the warrior sword. He had Idun's blessing, which Hela had told him was stronger than he could feel yet. That divine blessings accumulated in ways that were not always visible until the moment they mattered. And he had, circling at a distance from the battle, something he had noticed on his second aerial pass that he had not been sure about and was now fairly certain of. A dragon, a creature that had arrived with the invasion force and had been kept at the rear, not as a weapon exactly, but as something the enemy had brought along that they expected to use later, when the initial assault had created the right conditions. It had not been committed to the battle yet. It was still far enough back that its handlers had not noticed the falcon circling above them. Taeho thought about the dragon commander. He thought about what it had required in the mines, the specific moment of assertion, the connection at a level below ordinary cognition. He thought about whether it would work on a creature this large, this powerful, this clearly intended as someone else's asset. He thought about the giant, and the warriors who were being ground down against it, and what the battle's outcome looked like from up here. He dove. Not at the dragon. Toward it, which was different, approaching at an angle that kept him out of the sight lines of the handlers, until he was close enough that distance was no longer the protective factor it had been. The Dragon Commander ability rose in him like a second language, coming back after years of disuse, present, and demanding, and asking him to commit before he had fully decided. He committed. The dragon noticed him. Its handlers noticed a second later. There was a brief period, perhaps 4 seconds, where the outcome was genuinely unclear, where the creature's own nature and the handler's commands, and Taeho's reaching assertion, were all operating simultaneously, and the result was not yet determined. Then the dragon's head turned toward him with a different quality than it had been turning toward the handlers. He rode it into battle from the rear. This was not a thing that anyone on either side of the field had expected. The enemy forces, seeing their own creature arrive from the wrong direction carrying the wrong rider, experienced a moment of organizational confusion that compacted several seconds of tactical reality into a single instant of uncertainty. The warriors on Taeho's side, seeing the same thing, experienced something closer to a collective intake of breath. The giant's handlers were among the first things the dragon reached. Without coordination, without the specific signals that kept a giant of this type focused on a target, the creature's attack patterns changed. The warriors who had been grinding against it found the engagement shifting. The giant was still enormous and still dangerous, but it was now dangerous in multiple directions rather than one, which is a completely different problem. Taeho stayed with the dragon as long as the dragon commander could hold it. That was not indefinitely. The binding was real but not permanent, and he could feel the edges of it, the creature's own will pushing back, the energy required to maintain the connection drawing on reserves that were not bottomless. He pushed it anyway. Not past the breaking point, but close enough to the breaking point that the work being done was maximum. The cost arrived without announcement. A strike from a secondary enemy force, something he had not seen coming because he was focused on the dragon, hit him full force. His armor absorbed part of it. His body absorbed the rest. He fell from the dragon's back at a height that he registered abstractly as too high, and hit the ground with an impact that his body communicated in a very specific and comprehensive language. He lay there. He could see the sky. He could hear the battle continuing. He could not immediately get his limbs to respond to requests. In his hand, he still held the golden apple. Hela had given it to him before the campaign. A gift, she had said, with the slightly careful tone of someone who wanted to explain the significance without making it feel weighted. She had said that Idun's blessing sometimes required a catalyst to fully express itself. She had said the apple was that catalyst. She had said she hoped he would not need it. He needed it. He activated it. The effect was immediate and total. Not gradual healing, not the steady regeneration that Idun's blessing provided in normal circumstances. A complete restoration, the kind that landed like a switch being thrown at the level of his entire body simultaneously. Pain that had been comprehensive became absence of pain. Bones that had been considering their structural integrity found it again. A body that had been close to its absolute limit discovered it had more. Even the warriors near him, veterans of divine favor, people who had seen blessings do extraordinary things, went briefly still. Razgrid, who had been 30 meters away managing a flanking problem, turned at the change in the battlefield's energy and saw Taeho get up from where he had fallen. She watched him for a moment. Whatever she concluded, she did not say it. She returned her attention to the flanking problem. But there was something in the way she positioned herself afterward, placing herself closer to where he was operating, in a way that had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with command judgment, that told him the calculation she had been running about him had produced a new result. The giant fell. It took another 20 minutes and the coordinated effort of every significant warrior on the field, but it fell. The moment it fell, the invasion force lost the organizational confidence that it had been operating on, and the battle shifted from a grinding contest of endurance into something that resolved with relative speed. Afterward, the field was quiet in the way that battlefields are quiet after the noise stops, a silence full of aftermath. Warriors who had been in combat came down from the specific attention that fighting required and found themselves in bodies that needed rest. Medical support moved through the field. Fires were built. People sat near each other without speaking because the requirement to speak had temporarily suspended itself. Taeho sat with Jor. Jor had taken a cut above his left eye that had stopped bleeding and would become a scar in a few days. He was eating something that Taeho declined to identify too closely. He was in a good mood, because Jor's relationship with survival had always been essentially cheerful. He told Taeho that he had done something remarkable with the dragon. He said it the way he said most things, straightforwardly, without decoration, as a simple observation about facts. Taeho told him that he was not entirely sure it had been the right decision. Jor thought about this for a moment. He said that right decision and necessary decision were not always the same, and that the field had a way of making the distinction clear, and that the dragon had arrived at the right time on the right side, which was the part that mattered. Taeho did not argue with this. He was too tired to argue with anything that was not actively threatening him. Ralph appeared from somewhere and sat down without invitation and began describing the moment Taeho had dropped from the dragon with the specific narrative enthusiasm of someone who planned to tell this story many times. He was already editing it for maximum impact. Taeho let him. The version Ralph was constructing was not inaccurate exactly. It simply had a cinematic quality that the actual event, experienced from inside, had notably lacked. Hela found him later, when the camp had settled into the long quiet of recovery. She sat down across from him and looked at him with the expression she used when she was going to say something real rather than something careful. He had learned the difference. She said that Idun's blessing had responded to him in a way she had not seen before, that the golden apple's effect was stronger the more the blessing had built up in a warrior, and that the amount of divine power that had been visible around him when he stood up was, she paused, looking for the right word, considerable. He asked what considerable meant. She said it meant that the gods were paying attention. Not just Idun necessarily. Gods noticed when a warrior demonstrated that kind of connection to divine favor, because the war's dynamics were shaped by where divine attention flowed, and divine attention followed extraordinary things. He considered this. He was not sure how to feel about gods paying attention to him. It seemed like the kind of thing that came with consequences. She told him there was a celebration banquet in 3 days. She told him that he had been mentioned in the after-action review in terms that commanders usually reserved for warriors who had been fighting Ragnarok for years. She told him that the promotion review would include his name. He asked what promotion meant at his stage. She told him, from rookie warrior to lower-class warrior, not a large step in the absolute scale of Valhalla's hierarchy. A large step for someone who had arrived less than half a year ago not knowing which end of a sword was the useful one. He nodded. She stayed. They did not talk about anything important for a while, which was its own kind of important. 3 days later, the banquet. It was larger than the post-battle celebrations Taeho had attended before. A formal affair rather than the spontaneous gather-around-the-fire versions that followed individual campaigns. Tables long enough that warriors at one end could not see the other. Food that was still not what Taeho would have chosen but had improved from the early weeks in ways he suspected were related to the cooks deciding he was worth additional effort. Speeches were made. Taeho listened to them with the particular attention of someone who was being discussed in speeches for the first time and was still adjusting to the experience. Warriors who had been in the same campaigns were named. Contributions were acknowledged. His name came up more than he expected. When the promotion was read out, his name, attached to the new rank of lower-class warrior, to the traditional acknowledgement that he had proven himself in conditions that counted, the reaction in the hall was not the polite recognition that attended most individual promotions. The hall was loud, not politely loud, genuinely loud, in the way that large groups of people are loud when they have witnessed something with their own eyes and have been waiting for the formal acknowledgement to catch up with what they already knew. Jor was loudest. This was not a surprise. Ralph was immediately beside Jor, adding to the noise with the specific enthusiasm of someone who felt that the noise level was a craft project requiring his personal contribution. Ciri, seated near the senior end of the table, raised her cup toward him with the quiet precision of someone for whom that gesture contained more than its physical weight. Razgrid, on the other side of the hall, met his eyes briefly. She did not raise a cup. She simply held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone who had been running a long calculation and was now satisfied with the result. Taeho sat through all of it and felt something he had difficulty naming. Not pride exactly. He had won enough competitions that the sensation of being recognized was not new. Something different. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with being the best, and everything to do with having been tested by the same conditions as the people around him, and having come through them alongside rather than above. He had arrived in Valhalla as an accident, as a misunderstanding, he had thought. As someone who had no business being here, he was beginning to revise that assessment. The banquet ran long. Warriors who fought together celebrated the way they fought, with the complete commitment of people who had learned that the time for doing something fully was the time you had, not the time you were waiting for. Taeho ate until the food stopped tasting like survival necessity and started tasting like something chosen. He talked to Jor about things that had nothing to do with combat, which was its own relief. He accepted Ralph's increasingly elaborate retelling of the dragon incident, with the patience of someone who understood that the version Ralph was refining would become the version people remembered, and that this was not entirely a bad thing. Hela was present through most of it, not seated beside him. There were conventions about where guides and warriors sat in formal contexts, but present in the way that people are present when they have decided to be somewhere rather than simply ending up there. He caught her eye across the table at one point. She smiled, not the professional smile she had used when she first introduced herself as his guide, but the simpler one that meant something had gone well enough to be genuinely pleased about. He looked away before his expression could do something that Ralph would notice and add to the ongoing narrative project. The night wound down. Warriors left in pairs and groups. Fires burned lower. The hall, which had been full of noise enough to feel inhabited at a physical level, became quieter in stages. Taeho was among the last to leave. He stepped out into the night air that Valhalla produced. Not quite like earth air, carrying something underneath it that he had stopped trying to name and simply accepted as part of the texture of where he was, and stood for a moment in the open space between the hall and the residential quarters. He had come a long way from the man who had died at a keyboard. He was aware of this. He was also aware that the distance still remaining was considerably larger than the distance covered, and that Valhalla had a way of making sure you understood this before you became too comfortable with recent progress. The awareness arrived in the form of a man. He was standing at the edge of the light from the hall's open door. Taeho had not noticed him there, which was itself information, because his awareness of his environment had improved significantly in the past months, and someone standing that close without registering was not the kind of thing that happened by accident. The man was not large in the way that Jor was large. He was lean, and the leanness had nothing relaxed in it. It was the leanness of something that had been reduced to exactly what it needed to be, with nothing left over. He had the eyes of someone who looked at other people and saw capability distributions rather than individuals, and the expression of someone who had already drawn a conclusion and was waiting to verify it. His name was Ragnar. Taeho knew the name. It circulated among warriors the way certain names did, not because the person sought attention, but because what they had done made attention unavoidable. Ragnar was a warrior whose rank placed him in a category that Taeho's own new lower-class status could not yet fully conceptualize. Someone who had fought Ragnarok's campaigns across spans of time that made Taeho's several months look like a single afternoon. He said that he had watched the banquet. He said he had watched several of the campaigns, too. He said this without particular warmth or coldness, the tone of a craftsman describing a material assessment. He said he wanted to test something. The duel began without ceremony. This was the part that Taeho had not been trained for. Not because nobody had warned him that warriors of higher rank sometimes issued tests to warriors who attracted attention, but because no amount of warning fully prepared a person for the experience of being tested by someone whose skill existed at a level that made his own feel preliminary. Ragnar did not immediately destroy him. This was, Taeho would later understand, deliberate. The man was not here to demonstrate overwhelming force, which would have told him very little. He was here to see what Taeho actually had, which required letting Taeho actually show it. So the duel had a shape. Taeho brought everything he had, the dragon eyes reading Ragnar's patterns, the warrior sword matching his own saga against the other man's, the reflexes that had been built from both gaming and genuine battle experience. He used all of it simultaneously, which was something he had not been able to do even 2 months ago. It was not enough. Ragnar's responses to each thing Taeho brought were not desperate or labored. They were easy in the way that demonstrated mastery is easy. Not because the moves required no thought, but because the thought required was so embedded in the practitioner's body that it no longer needed to be thought consciously. He redirected, countered, and placed Taeho in positions that were educational rather than lethal, because a test that destroyed the subject provided less information than a test that pushed it to the edge and held it there. Taeho was held at the edge. He ran out of options in sequence. First the positioning advantages, then the saga abilities, then the raw adaptation that he fell back on when strategy ran out, and which had saved him in situations where nothing else had. Ragnar closed the last gap with a movement that Taeho could see but could not respond to, because seeing it and responding to it were separated by a gulf of experience that had not yet been bridged. He was on the ground. He looked up at the night sky of Valhalla. It was doing the thing it sometimes did, a quality of light at the edge of the dark that was not quite any color he had a name for. He had stopped trying to describe it. Ragnar stood above him. He was not breathing hard. He looked at Taeho with the expression of someone whose assessment had been confirmed in a specific direction, though which direction Taeho could not yet tell. He said that Taeho had a great many abilities, and that the abilities were genuine, and that what was missing was the time to have learned what to do when abilities ran out. He said that this was not a criticism. He said it the way someone states an architectural fact about a building that is still under construction. He said that he would come back. He walked away from the edge of the light and into the dark, and the sound of his footsteps stopped with the specific abruptness of someone who had decided they were finished being heard. Taeho lay on the ground for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Not from injury. Ragnar had been precise about that, leaving him bruised and thoroughly outmatched but not damaged in ways that would need Hela's attention. He lay there because the ground felt like an honest place to be for a moment, after an honest conversation conducted in the language of force rather than words. He had just become a lower-class warrior. He had just ridden a dragon into battle. He had just been healed by a divine blessing powerful enough to stop veterans in their tracks. He had a saga that had made his guide apologize on the first day. Ragnar had not noticed any of this as an obstacle. There was a distance between where he was and where warriors like Ragnar existed, and tonight had been that distance becoming fully visible rather than something he could approximate from a comfortable remove. He stared at the sky and felt the familiar weight of a competition where he was not yet the best player in the room, and where being the best player in the room was genuinely far away, and where the gap was clear and specific and therefore, if he was honest, something he knew what to do with. He got up. Jor was sitting on a crate about 15 meters away, eating something, watching him with the expression of a man who had been there long enough to have seen this particular experience happen to many people and had simply decided to be nearby rather than intervene. Taeho walked over and sat down next to him. Jor offered him whatever he was eating. Taeho took it without looking at it and ate. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Jor said that Ragnar had issued that kind of test to 3 other warriors this year, and 2 of them had requested transfers to different legions immediately afterward, and 1 of them had not gotten back up for a concerning amount of time. Taeho had gotten up. He said this without making it into more than it was. A simple notation of fact. Taeho thought about Ragnar's parting words, that he would come back. It was not a threat. It was something closer to a standing appointment, the indication that what had happened tonight was not an ending, but a reference point, a before, a place in time that would eventually have an after worth measuring against it. He thought about the saga, with its pages that Hela still would not give him the count of. He thought about synchronization at 9%, and how each percent had unlocked things he had not known were possible, and how many percent remained, and what lived there waiting. He looked out at the dark where Ragnar had gone, and felt the particular appetite that had driven him his entire life. Not the appetite for winning exactly, but the appetite for the distance between where he was and where the best was, treated not as discouragement, but as geography, traversable geography. The kind with a path, even if the path was long and the terrain was difficult and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Somewhere ahead in Valhalla's war, the larger shape of what he was becoming was waiting for him to catch up to it. He did not know yet what it looked like, but Ragnar would come back, and when he did, the distance was going to be smaller.